This is TWiT.
I did want to note some follow-up and a little more detail about what I mentioned last week, because Wyoming and New York's governors had both signed some executive orders. And just as we were starting the podcast, news came that the California Senate had passed, I think it was 21-12, some similar legislation. The idea being that states have a lot of power over, what happens within their borders. And while even though the major ISPs were lobbying hard to prevent states from going their own way relative to net neutrality, it turns out there are strict limits over what the federal government can do, because, for example, states have control over their purse and they can decide how they want to spend their money. So what happened was that we had a bill that passed through California's Senate that is now moving on to the Assembly. And I just checked my notes. It did pass 21-12. However, this looks like it's just the beginning. There are also a group of 22 state attorneys general that have gathered together and filed a suit against the FCC. It turns out that it's not possible, much as the FCC would like to simply change their own rules. There's laws that govern what the FCC is able to do, and it's necessary for the FCC to demonstrate that conditions have changed sufficiently since an original law was put in place for them to use that to justify subsequent change. And that hasn't happened since the net neutrality law was brought up. It's called the Open Internet Order in 2015. So it turns out that 22 states have joined together in an action against the FCC to challenge the Ajit Pai's much noticed decision just to toss that 2015 decision out. But more importantly, the EFF, of course, our friends at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, are very much involved in this. They posted a sort of a response to California's action, sounding a little annoyed. Apparently, they were involved in the lawmaking, and for whatever reason, I don't know anything about what's going on behind the scenes politically, but the legislation which California has passed so far, they worry would not stand legal challenge. Ernesto Falcon, writing for the EFF, said that there were much stronger things that California lawmakers could have done, and he enumerated 3, which are really interesting. So I wanted to share them with our listeners, because this gives us a sense for just how much clout states actually do have over what goes on inside their borders. First, Ernesto writes that California spends hundreds of millions of dollars on ISPs, including AT&T, as part of its California Broadband Subsidy Program. He says the state could require that recipients of that funding provide a free and open internet to ensure that taxpayer funds are used to benefit California residents rather than subsidizing a discriminatory network. He writes, this is one of the strongest means the state has to promote network neutrality, and it's missing from this legislation which just passed, which was SB 460. Secondly, he writes, California also has oversight and power over more than 4 million utility poles that ISPs benefit from accessing to deploy their networks. In California, he says, in fact, California is expressly empowered by federal law to regulate access to the polls, and the state legislature can establish network neutrality conditions in exchange for access to the polls. He says, again, that is not in the current bill passed by the Senate. And then third, each city negotiates a franchise with the local cable company, and often the company agrees to a set of conditions in exchange for access to valuable taxpayer-funded rights of way. California's legislature, he says, can directly empower local communities to negotiate with ISPs to require network neutrality in exchange for the benefit of accessing taxpayer-funded infrastructure. He says this is also not included in the California bill. So I thought, I wanted to do some more digging into this because, of course, this has been a big topic of ours and of huge interest. And the voting public has demonstrated overwhelming support for the concept of net neutrality, which, for reasons of the way Washington works with power brokers and lobbying and money, isn't what our government has been doing. But it looks like at the state level, there is very, very strong capability of enforcing this locally. So as I noted at the top, I think we're far from losing this.
Well, I'm glad you're bullish.
Think?
We had Denise Howell on New Screensavers, and of course the issue always comes down to interstate commerce. States are forbidden from interfering with interstate commerce, and I imagine the Supreme Court will have, at the long run, will have the deciding vote on all of this. And meanwhile, while this is going to be battled, as it will be, for weeks and months and maybe even years, we won't have net neutrality because that's the current situation. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. There's all these lawsuits. There's 21 lawsuits from 21 states, and we'll see.